Queen Elizabeth II has outlined the government's plans for the next 2 years. It comes as Prime Minister Theresa May has had to drop several high-profile campaign promises after losing her parliamentary majority. Now, the Queen has also promised a public inquiry into the Grenfell Tower fire that killed about 79 people. The opening of Parliament was relatively low-key this year compared with the usual pomp and ceremony.
My Lords and members of the House of Commons, my government's priority is to secure the best possible deal as the country leaves the European Union. My government will initiate a full public inquiry into the tragic fire at Grenfell Tower to ascertain the causes and ensure that the appropriate lessons are learnt. To support victims, my government will take forward measures to introduce an independent public advocate who will act for bereaved families after a public disaster and support them at public inquests. In the light of the terrorist attacks in Manchester and London, my government's counter-terrorism strategy will be reviewed to ensure that the police and security services have all the powers they need, and that the length of custodial sentences for terrorism-related offences are sufficient to keep the population safe.
Now, Richard Bestick joins us in London with more on the Queen's speech. Richard, as always, welcome to the show. Now, we suddenly hear that Brexit dominated her speech today. Give us the highlights.
Well, Lucia, as you heard there from Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, reflected in that Queen's speech were the terror and tragic events of the summer. But at its core, it was all about Brexit, repealing effectively the 44 years of legislation that have been put in place during the British relationship with the European Union. Now, that legislation covers just about every area of life in Britain. Of the 27 pieces of legislation in the Queen's speech, 8 were taken up with Brexit-related issues, the issues of immigration, the issues of fisheries, of agriculture. Britain will be pulling out of the EU's Euratom organisation, so it needs its own nuclear safety legislation. Every area of life, it will dominate discussions inside that place for the next 2 years, despite the fact that it took the Queen just 9 minutes to read it out. Now, it's called the Queen's speech, but it is really the government's agenda, written by the government and handed to the Queen to read out. And it is their agenda, in this case, for the next 2 years. Normally it's just 1 year, but Brexit is such a complicating factor, they're going to spread it over 2 years. The leader of the Labour opposition, Jeremy Corbyn, called it a threadbare document with hardly enough to keep Parliament busy for a year. Hardly will keep Parliament busy for a year, let alone 2 years. The problem, he says, is that they've dropped all their controversial promises from the general election, and as a consequence, not only have they lost their majority, but they've run out of ideas too. But there you go, yes, you're absolutely right. It's Brexit all the way.
Now, Richard, this year's speech suddenly follows the snap election that took place in the country. How did the Queen's speech address Theresa May's win and suddenly the political environment right now?
Well, the political environment is interesting. It's shifting. The latest opinion poll that I read in a newspaper today suggests that the Labour opposition, since the election, has now gone 3 points into the lead. So there seems to be a shifting of sands here. And that was reflected, that shifting of sands and that general election outcome in which UK Prime Minister Theresa May lost her 17-seat majority in the Parliament building. That's reflected in the dropping of all these promises that were made by the party during the election on controversial social issues. They've all gone. And the Prime Minister herself is taking a far more conciliatory tone, reaching out to the opposition parties, because she now has the difficult task of getting that massively complicated Brexit legislation through the Parliament over the next 2 years in time for it to coincide with the end of the EU-UK talks, which started in Brussels just yesterday. If they don't, there's a possibility they could crash out of the EU without any of the relevant legislation in place. But even worse, if it goes badly wrong, it could bring down UK Prime Minister, the UK Prime Minister, and indeed even her government. There's talk here that she won't see out the summer as Prime Minister. And that poses all sorts of problems for stability, so much wanted, so much desired by the European Union in these Brexit talks.
Well, many thanks, Richard, for those insights. Richard Bestick joining us there in London.